Welcome to the Lord of the Rings Lorecast, the show that explores the background of Tolkien's amazing world from the very beginning. As we begin Chapter 9, Barrels Out of Bound, we are again traveling deeper into the land of the Fae, directly, in this case, to the stronghold of the Elven Kingdom. In this section, you'll see a number of places where Tolkien continues to ratchet up the tension and the severity of the situation they're in, while still reminding us, like on last episode, that the elves are not evil. They are other. They are something that the dwarves and Bilbo haven't dealt with directly yet in the story. Sure, we got a little bit of a glimpse of them when they were rushing towards the campfires and in the situation we just read about with Thorin. But this is the point at which we actually get into what elves are like, according to The Hobbit. And there's a lot that Tolkien is pulling from his previous writings. I've mentioned on previous episodes how Thranduil came from Doriath, was one of Thingol's people. And there's more than just a connection here based on where he came from. I think you'll notice that there are a lot of similarities between Doriath and Menegroth, the caves of Menegroth, and this woodland realm of Thranduil's. You have a number of similarities here. You have the deep forest. This is a very deep and dark forest that feels mysterious and magical. You have a river as a boundary, this guarded river in the case of the Woodland realm, and the river Escalduin, and on top of that, the girdle of Melian, but you don't really have a girdle in this situation. But it is surrounded by a certain quality of magic and mystery, which is common. You have a gate that goes to an underground city, stronghold, halls, this cavernous area. In both cases, the stone halls are carved out of the living rock as described in both locations. And you also have a very isolationist kind of mentality to the elves in both situations. And so it would make sense that Thranduil grew up and was from a community that felt very much like that. And so therefore he would create that in a new place. It also makes sense that Tolkien really liked these themes and wanted to play on them some more in The Hobbit. But it also could be that Thranduil sees himself as the new Thingol. Now, there are similarities in, of course, the place that they live, but also the mentality and all of that. You don't have a Melian to complete the equation here, and you also have a realm that is primarily wood elves, and as I discussed in the bonus episode last week, maybe a mix of other things. But there is a lot to connect the two, and it would make sense that somebody like Thranduil, who is so proud, and that is a similarity with Thingol, by the way, would want to create what Thingol had again in this part of the world. And this intro is going to go a little bit longer than usual because there are some connections here to the inspirations from different myths. You have, in Celtic mythology, the other world is often accessed through some sort of hidden gate in a forest, across a bridge, or across running water. We'll see those descriptions as we read through the text, but also forests in Celtic mythology are enchanted and guarded, and time passes strangely, like we've noted before. That fits for the surrounding environment of this community where they live in a forest. In Norse mythology, the Alfar, the elves of Norse mythology, were sometimes associated with underground dwellings. They were considered to be beautiful and yet aloof. Who does that sound like? Also, in Norse mythology, you have the Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge, which is guarded by Heimdall. Heimdall? Like, pronunciation is difficult. There's an ALLR at the end of that name. But you probably are familiar with this from like the Thor movies and the MCU. But that bridge is a bridge over a river guarding the entrance into a magical city. So you have a very similar thing here. And you might be wondering, wait a minute, I thought dwarves were the ones who lived underground. I thought elves were the ones that lived in trees. Why isn't that more common both in mythology and in this book here and Tolkien's other writings? Well, actually, the case is in Norse mythology, elves and dwarves both at times dwelt underground. Of course, they had a high respect for living things like trees and the growing things, nature, animals, those kinds of things. They lived in harmony with the world around them. And you'll notice that the way they live underground is more in harmony than, say, the dwarves. The dwarves seek to craft and cut their way through the ground, to mine and excavate, whereas the elves tend more to shape the living rock through their own magical means, as sometimes it's described. Almost like they're coaxing the rock to shape itself around what they need, but for the most part, leaving the caverns to their natural shapes. So one more thing before we get into the text. Think about the bridge and the gate and the river. These not only show up together in a lot of mythology and other works and things like that, but they also show up on their own. They also have their own symbology that's associated with each. So a bridge is usually a sign of transition between two different states, between insider and an outsider, life and death, those types of things. A gate is seen as a barrier. There's a threshold. There's something to be gotten on the other side of that barrier, whether that is treasure or freedom. Sometimes that's the case. And then you have rivers, which are often enchanted and are a sign of danger and also a sign of a loss of control, which we've already seen in this story with Bombur falling into the river and falling asleep. Crossing this magical threshold into the caves is another form of loss of control. They aren't going to sleep, but they are being captured. So keep all of that in mind as we get into the text this week. There's a lot to unpack. Here we go. The very first line of this chapter says, "The day after the battle with the spiders, Bilbo and the dwarves made one last despairing effort to find a way out before they died of hunger and thirst." If this story hasn't been ratcheting up the tension already, then we are there. We are at the boundary of the very existence, the very life or death existence of at least the majority of the party here. The narrator is telling us that something drastic has to happen. They stagger on, they make a guess about which way to go for the path. 8 of them say it's in this direction, the rest point other directions. And then it starts getting dark. And that feels like it's going to seal their doom. They're starving, they're lost, another night in the darkness. Who knows if the spiders will come back or what will happen to them. And then all of a sudden, we get the thing that is going to change their fate. Suddenly out sprang the light of many torches all round them, like hundreds of red stars. Again, the color red for the color of the fire of these wood elves. The wood elves leap out, they've got bows and spears, and they tell them to halt, of course. And the dwarves don't have any way to fight back, even if they had the energy. We're told that their small knives, the only weapons they had, would have been of no use against the arrows of the elves. And then we get this description here that could hit a bird's eye in the dark. You know how people will talk about the movies and they'll say, well, you should read the books, they're better, or the books are more accurate, or whatever. And of course, that is true for certain things. But one of the things that seems to be maybe misunderstood a little bit is how absolutely accurate wood elves are with bows and arrows. Legolas in the films rarely misses. I don't know if we've ever see him specifically miss more than an arrow gets deflected or something like that. And of course, he does crazy things like he surfs down the stairs on a shield and he climbs up a Mumakil and all of that. But the accuracy, the deadly accuracy of these elves, even in the dark with their bows, is not something that the movies just made up. No, this is here right in The Hobbit, right when we first actually meet them. And the dwarves know that they can't do anything about this. They basically sit down, they put down their weapons, and they're like, okay, cool, you got us. But Bilbo makes a quick decision here. He slides on the ring, or it says here, he popped on his ring and slipped quickly to one side. And there are a number of times where the ring is used in this section of the story, and I have to wonder why the elves weren't more aware of it. One of the things could be that, well, they clearly can see very well, and apparently in the dark, so why didn't they notice one of these individuals pop out of existence? There's hundreds of them, and a handful of dwarves and a hobbit, but you have to kind of let that stuff go, I think, for the story. Bilbo realizes quickly enough to pop the ring on and disappears. There's other moments that we'll get to where it seems like, wouldn't the elves hear him? But again, hobbits are very, very quiet when they want to be. The other thought is, well, wouldn't they detect or at least sense something malevolent, some sort of evil source? But you have to remember, this book was written before Tolkien knew that this was the One Ring and had developed that part of the story. He went back and edited things later, but I don't think he wanted to change all of these details. In fact, that would have been a little bit too much. I feel like it probably would have sidetracked the narrative here. And so we have Bilbo disappearing and the elves none the wiser. And it tells us so in the story itself. It says, nor did they hear or feel him trotting along well behind their torchlight as they led off their prisoners into the forest. And it reinforces the idea here that Bilbo's really, really far back. Like, he's letting them get way ahead, and he's being very careful to just creep behind them at quite the distance. The next part makes us very, very sure that neither the dwarves nor Bilbo actually understood where they were going. It was very dark. The dwarves were blindfolded. Even if they weren't blindfolded, they wouldn't have been able to see well enough to know exactly where they were going. And this is important for a reason. This woodland realm is hidden, kind of like Doriath. It's supposed to be hard to find. The forest is a dense and dark place. It's easy to lose your bearing, and there seems to be something about the magic of the forest that even when you think you know where you're going, you often don't. So the fact that Bilbo could have remembered how to get in and out of this location is addressed here, and we know for sure that he could not figure out where he was going if he hadn't been following the torches, is a symbolic part of the nature of this kind of fairy location. So this next part is where they stop, and Bilbo has to get close enough in order to follow them through, but it's also the place where we are first presented with the bridge, a bridge that led across the river to the king's doors. The water flowed dark and swift and strong beneath, and at the far end were gates before the mouth of a huge cave that ran into the side of a steep slope covered with trees. There's a picture in the book as well where Tolkien designs this to look a certain way, and I think one of the most interesting things about that drawing is that you can see the sky. It doesn't say that here in the text, but in Tolkien's drawing, the tops of the beech trees do not occlude the sky. It appears that there's actually some sort of gap in the trees. So much so that you can see beyond that to the rest of the forest and what appears to be a hill in the background. If this was another author or another artist, I would just kind of assume that this was a mistake. But this is Tolkien. He knows everything about the world that he's creating, and he's very intentional. So maybe there is a gap here. Maybe this is meant to be a main causeway that is cultivated and allows the starlight to come down to the elves and the sun, of course, but of course these elves are more about starlight, and to kind of light that passage into the front of this mysterious location. I can only speculate about that, but the things that we definitely do know is that there is a river, there's a bridge, there's a gate, and then there's also great beech trees running down the banks to the feet, till their feet were in the stream, the feet of the trees, which is an interesting thing. He could have just said roots, but he says feet. Again, he's anthropomorphizing other things in this world. The trees themselves are treated more like people by the elves, so it makes sense that they would have feet in the stream rather than roots. And now we're at another dilemma for Bilbo. It tells us that he did not like the look of the cavern mouth, and he only just made up his mind not to desert his friends just in time. And of course, he makes it over just on the heels of the last elves, and again, they don't notice him. This is another one of those moments where the tension is ratcheting up. We know that these dwarves are in danger, even though the elves aren't evil. They are captured at this point, and Bilbo is their only hope. And Bilbo's bravery breaks through again, just like it did when it came to the spiders. But it wasn't without effort. He had to will himself. His instinct was not to go in. This is dangerous. You'll get stuck in there, potentially, is what he's thinking. And yet he does anyway. Inside, we get the description about red torchlight again. And we get this note about the elf guards who sang as they marched along the twisting, crossing, echoing paths. And notice that these are twisting, crossing, and echoing, very much like the natural shape of the caves. But what's interesting here is that the elf guards are singing. This is another detail that is avoided in the films. My assumption here is that they thought if the elves sang and appeared too merry or too silly in doing so, that people wouldn't take them seriously. What's interesting about the way they're portrayed in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and sometimes in the other works, is that both of those things coincide at the same time. Tolkien had no problem with singing elven guards and also a very dangerous situation where they have captured prisoners and those prisoners are in very real danger. Those two things can coincide. But yet, something about putting that on film seemed a little bit contradictory, maybe? I don't know. I'm speculating on that. And the note about singing is probably another note in order to explain to us how this is a different situation that they are in now compared to when they were last underground. And we're reminded in the next sentence, these were not like those of the goblin cities. They were smaller, less deep underground, and filled with a cleaner air. And I love that last little note about a cleaner air. I would imagine goblins don't bathe very often, and having hundreds of goblins in a confined space underground with all of the things that they eat, their waste, the different types of waste, food waste, and also their own excrement and all of that in a very confined area with very little breeze or any airflow at all would mean that those caves were disgusting. It's not something that you think about very often, but absolutely the air would be not just stagnant, and it describes it earlier, but also it would smell like the worst restroom you've ever been in. It's time for that spring reset. I'm taking a look at everything in my closet and figuring out that, oh no, this absolutely needs to go. And it's about time I replace things so that my clothes aren't older than my 15-year-old. Now you might think that they lasted that long because they were well made, but no, they're in terrible condition. Unlike the new jeans I just got from Quince. Jeans have always been my personal go-to because you can kind of wear them for lots of different things, but maybe they're not your thing. Maybe you're looking for, 100% European linen with insanely soft flow knit activewear fabric. It's definitely getting warmer, and their flow knit activewear is moisture wicking, anti-odor, and soft enough that you'll actually want to wear it every day. So pick out what you want. You can't go wrong because they have prices 50 to 60% less than similar brands. And like I said before, they are high quality. I continue to wear their clothes all the time, and I know that these new jeans are going to last me a lot better than the other things in my wardrobe. And on top of it, they look great. They're so comfortable, and I spent just as much on the jeans that I am now cleaning out of my wardrobe. So if you're looking for something better, just all around better, go check out Quince. So go do it right now. Refresh your wardrobe with Quince. Go to quince.com/ringslore for free shipping and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. Go to quince.com/ringslore for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/ringslore. This is different. The air is cleaner. Elves, it seems, bathe. They take care of their own society. They probably clean things out. They take out the garbage. They probably recycle. They do all the things that elves would do in order to maintain their home and make it a place that they want to live. Goblins, on the other hand, not so much. Also, it notes here that their pillars are hewn out of the living stone, and that the Elven King sat on a chair of carved wood. This is another one of those details, like I mentioned in the beginning part, about how they live cooperatively with nature, in balance with nature. Pillars hewn out of the living stone. Hewn, so sure, they shaped them, they cut them, but the stone is living. It seems as if they had permission to do so. It doesn't say that here, but it kind of implies that kind of quality. And the king's chair is carved in wood. It is a piece of the Woodland realm brought into this underground space in order to decorate it. And you would probably also assume that the tree that was taken from was replanted, and they maintain the things and their connection to nature in doing this. It also implies a little bit more comfort than having a stone throne, which you might expect for somebody like the dwarves. His crown also has berries and red leaves. And the next note here is very interesting. For the autumn was come again. In the spring, he wore a crown of woodland flowers. So of course, he's an elven king. He's going to decorate his crown, or the crown itself will be made out of the very nature and the season that it currently is in the world. This is again being in symbiosis with nature around them. Now there's this last little note about what the king is holding. In his hand, he held a carven staff of oak. There's a reason this isn't beech. Beech is softer. Oak is hard. It is strong. It is resilient. This is symbolic of the king. But it also might be stubborn. You could use strong and resilient, and it's not too far to get to stubborn in the list of synonyms. So now we're at the place where the dwarves are brought before the elves, and we get our as the readers, second version of the events that we just saw take place with Thorin and the king. And you may have read through that passage and thought, wow, Thorin's really got it together. He's keeping a tight lip. He doesn't want to betray anything about their quest, about going back to the Lonely Mountain, any of those kinds of things, because they don't know if these wood elves are going to be allies or not. And they have a lot of reason to assume they won't be. And maybe that's just because he's Thorin. He's supposed to be the king. He's shrewd. He's intelligent, and smart, and wise. But yet, the rest of the dwarves are exactly the same way when it comes to dealing with this elven king. It feels like this is more of a natural dwarven response and a loyalty to their mission than it is anything particular to Thorin himself. The prisoners were brought before him, and they all looked grimly at them, the elves looking at the prisoners. He told his men to unbind them, for they were ragged and weary. Notice that he chooses to let them go, well, not free, but unbound, because he can tell that they're exhausted. He has some level of empathy here, and it's very specifically stated. It's obvious, for they were ragged and weary. Now, he knows that they can't escape, so there is a safety net there, and he knows that they're ragged and weary, so they would have a hard time of it anyway. But at the same time, this feels like it's conveying a certain level of comfort allotted to these individuals. If he knew they were enemies to begin with, he probably would have just killed them, but he's more interested in why they're there and what's going on. Besides, they need no ropes in here, said he. There is no escape from my magic doors for those who are once brought inside. This is an important line because it not only heightens the tension like so many other things have done recently, it lets us know that without some form of assistance, without some way to break out of this location in a means that doesn't require going through their magic doors, they're not getting out. They are stuck. This is another one of those situations, just kind of like the one in the spiders a few episodes ago, where it feels like the narrator is saying there is no visible way for them to get out of the situation, or as far as they know, they are done. They are stuck. And unless somebody figures out something very clever, they're going to be stuck. And of course, who's the most clever among them at this point? It's Bilbo. And Bilbo's the only one not actually being captured in this moment. And we as the readers know this, but we also are confronted with this idea that, well, the king believes that there's no way to escape. So maybe they're going to have to do something else. Now, he questions them. He really wants to get down to why they're here because he wouldn't get any answer out of Thorin. But it says here he got little more news out of them than out of Thorin. They were surly and angry and did not even pretend to be polite. This feels very dwarvish. And I love this this section right here. "What have we done, O king?" said Balin, who was the eldest left. "Is it a crime to be lost in the forest, to be hungry and thirsty, to be trapped by spiders?" Those seem all like very legitimate questions and are exactly what they were going through. "Are the spiders your tame beasts or your pets if killing them makes you angry?" Here's where he may have messed up, because it seems like he's trying to figure out why they're so angry at him. And he's going, well, what have we done other than kill spiders? So why would you come after us? But it seems kind of silly to assume that these, what appear to be very evil spiders, are somehow pets of the woodland elves. And this, of course, makes the king angrier than ever. And he answers, "It is a crime to wander in my realm without leave. Do you forget that you were in my kingdom using the road that my people made? Did you not 3 times pursue and trouble my people in the forest and rouse the spiders with your riot and clamor? After all the disturbance you have made, I have a right to know what brings you here. And if you will not tell me, I will keep you all in prison until you have learned sense and manners." If you only read this up to the line that says, "I have a right to know what brings you here," that sounds all very reasonable. You have strayed into my borders. You have pursued my people. They were scared of you. You have roused the spiders, which are not ours and not our friends, which puts us in more danger. And after all of this, I have a right to know what you're doing here. Like, why would you do all of that? That sounds very reasonable. If I was the king of a realm and somebody wandered into my territory and started doing this kind of stuff, I would wonder too. Now, he seems to have some suspicions about them, not just because they happen to be in his land, but because they are dwarves, and there is a history of bad blood between the dwarves and the elves. So there's definitely more going on than him being reasonable, but at least he's laying out the parts that are reasonable. Then we get to the part where he says he's going to keep them all in prison until they've learned sense and manners. That seems like a step too far. Does he really get to confine them until they respond and tell him what's going on? I suppose he has the right to, because they're on his land, but that seems a little severe. And also, he seems to not like the fact that they are so grumpy. But again, this might just be elves and dwarves doing their thing. I mean, they respond kind of angry at him. They're kind of grumpy. They're tired. They're exhausted. They aren't using their manners, which we know they can do. But in this situation, they're not. And, well, the king is using that against them in order to justify severe treatment. That part doesn't feel as good. Then he orders them all to be in separate cells, and you have to wonder, why separate cells? Well, if they're in separate cells, they can't communicate, they can't plan together, they can't concoct a story and pass it on to each other. They all are in separate cells, which means their communication is very limited, and if they are going to communicate, they're going to have to yell from one cell to another, which means the guards will hear them. But, like Thorin, they're given food and drink, and I have to imagine it's just the bare essentials, but at least they're not starving anymore. And again, it is reinforced that they are not going to be allowed to leave until they're willing to tell him what he wanted to know. And they have a very good reason for not doing so. They do not trust the elves. And on top of it, if the elves were aware that they were going to get their mountain back, that they were going to get their treasure back, they know that Thranduil will be interested in that he will want to have a piece of that. And if there is some way that he can manipulate the situation so that he can get the treasure and get rid of a dragon, that is very beneficial for him living in such close proximity to the Lonely Mountain. But there's one thing he keeps back at the end of this section that he does not tell him. And he seems to be utilizing a certain level of information and personal personality, this whole thing about like your manners and all of that in order to try to manipulate them. He doesn't tell them that Thorin is also there. So you have to imagine at this point in the story that Thorin's cell is far enough away from the rest of them that they can't tell that there's somebody else there and that it is Thorin. If they were to hear his voice, they would know. But this section ends with the sentence, "It was Bilbo who found that out." another nice little moment where Tolkien gives us the end before we get there. We know that Bilbo's going to find out, and we're reminded at the very end of all of this, which seems like they're surviving, but they're in a terrible situation, that Bilbo's still there. And like the situation with the spiders, he might find a way out of this. So here's some fun news before we get into the patrons and all of that stuff. I will be at GCX in Orlando, Florida this summer, July 25th and 26th. It is a big sort of gaming kind of nerd fest kind of thing with lots of different famous people, voice actors, game studios. There's all sorts of presentations, and creators like myself may be featured in different things. We're still in the works figuring that out, but I might actually do some sort of recording for an episode, probably a Fallout Lorecast or Elder Scrolls Lorecast kind of episode. But it depends. It depends on who's going to be there, and maybe I'll get some interviews with some voice actors who have worked on things, including things like, Lord of the Rings types of stuff. So we're going to have to see. But the news right now is that I will be there July 25th and 26th, Orlando GCX, and I'll put a link in the show notes and all of that stuff for all of you. So if you happen to be nearby and you want to go, if you happen to want to take a vacation this summer and go down to this really fun event, look it up. GCXevent.com if you want more information. It's also a big fundraiser, so it's for a very good cause and all of that. So anyway, that's a thing coming up. Just thought I'd put that out there. Also, have to thank our newest patrons, patreon.com/LOTR Lorecast for Kakper, Philip M, and Ginger Fury. Welcome to the Patreon. So glad that you decided to sign up and join us. Also, I have to shout out all of our VIP patrons. Here we go. AK Music Lover, Aldarian was right, Apollo, Averial, Azel Razzle, I'm probably still mispronouncing that one, Barney D, Bo, Brandy D, Captain Legolas Turner, Cutter Metalworks, Daniel Nightweaver, David S, David M, Divine Madman, Fulcrum, George B, Gerald CFC, Gimli a Break, Ginger Fury, Huon is my hero, Jezer, Katie S, Capenna, Lori B, Mason Weathertop, Matt, Party Snacks, Philip M, Richard J, Rosie Rose, Single Ent Looking for Entwives, The Bestest Boy, TJT, and Tour Son of Hoor. Thank you so much, everybody, for your support. And as always, if you want to help me out, you can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or whatever other service you listen to this on. You can also share it with your friends, all of that. If you do leave a review in the US on Apple, then I will read it out in a future episode of 5-star review. Don't have any new ones this week, but that means if you leave one this week, then I'll probably read it next week. So thanks again for all the support. And if you're considering something to do this summer and you want to hang out, I mean, I'll be there. I think there's even like a chance to go to one of the theme parks or something. I don't know. I don't know all the details yet, but I'll definitely be there, and I'm happy to shake hands and meet some people face to face and talk some Lord of the Rings or whatever. So check it out. GCX Event 2025. All right. Have a wonderful rest of your week. And I'm going to go answer there's a really cool question about the timeline of the things that were written in order. I'm going to get into that in the bonus episode. So if you're interested in that, then you're welcome to sign up and join us on the Patreon. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to the Lord of the Rings Lorecast. If you'd like to learn more about other fantasy worlds, check out my other podcasts, the Elder Scrolls Lorecast, the Witcher Lorecast, and more at robotsradio.net. If you'd like to reach out, I'd love to hear from you. Send me a note on Twitter at robots_radio, or join our amazing community on the Robots Radio Discord. There are links in the show notes, or just search Robots Radio Discord, or find the link on robotsradio.net. I'll see you next time.